Today is Tuesday, March 31st, and this is the read aloud for Out of My Mind. If you remember from just yesterday, Melody and her classmates from room H5 joined music, their specials, as a part of the inclusion program. Hey, Claire, Molly said, twisting her arms above her head and bending her body so it looked crooked. Look at me! Look at me! She laughed so hard she snorted snot. Claire cracked up as well, but then let spit dribble out of her mouth. Duh, buh, wuh, buh, she said, crossing her eyes and pretending to slip out of her chair. Miss Lovelace finally noticed them because she said sternly, Stand up, please, Claire. But I didn't do anything, Claire replied. You stand as well, Molly, Mrs. Lovelace added. We were just laughing, Molly said defensively, but she stood up next to Claire. Mrs. Lovelace took both girls' chairs and slid them over to the wall. Well, why'd you do that? Claire cried out in protest. You have perfectly good bodies and legs that work. Use them, Mrs. Lovelace instructed. You can't make us stand the whole class, Claire moaned. The Board of Education requires that I teach you music. There is nothing in the rule book that requires you to sit down while I do it. Now stand there and be quiet, or I'll send you to the office for showing disrespect to our guests. They stood in the middle of the third row of chairs where everyone else was seated comfortably. They stood. This teacher is awesome! After that, things went more smoothly. Jill, who had continued to cry, had been taken back to our room by one of the aides. The rest of us sat quietly in the back of the room. Mrs. Lovelace began once more. I think we need a moment to gather ourselves, children. She sat down at her piano and began to play Moon River, and then she switched to the theme song from one of those new vampire movies. Oh yeah, she knew what we liked. When I started seeing the colors, I knew she was good. Forest green, lime green, emerald. I glanced over at Gloria. Instead of sitting all curled up like she usually did, her arms were outstretched like she was trying to catch the music and bring it to her. Her face was almost glowing. She began to sway with music. Then Mrs. Lovelace completely changed tempo and played the opening notes to Take Me Out to the Ball Game. Willie clapped his hands wildly. Finally, the teacher started to play Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy. Dad would have loved it. Kids started to shimmy in their seats. Maria got up and started dancing. She clapped loudly, never quite on beat, but to a rhythm that was all on her own. Mrs. Lovelace paused at the end of the song. Music is powerful, my young friends, she said. It can connect us to memories, it can influence our mood and our responses to problems we might face. She cut her eyes to Claire and Molly, who still stood in the empty places where their chairs had been. I wanted to tell Mrs. Lovelace I liked music too. I wanted to know if she'd ever heard the song Elvira, or if she would teach us how to make our own music. I tried to raise my hand, but she didn't notice me. It must have looked like just another one of those random movements that kids like me seem to make. But I had the feeling that Mrs. Lovelace was someone who'd take the time to figure me out. The teacher went on. Before I continue with the lesson, let's make this a real inclusion experience. Perhaps our friends from room H5 would like to sit with the rest of us instead of being stuck in the back. Freddie heard that and took his chance. He put his chair in gear and zoomed into the front of the big room and shouted, I am Freddie. I like music. I go fast. The class laughed. I can tell the difference between people making fun of us and people being nice to us. Freddie could too, so he joined in the laughter. Mrs. Lovelace looked momentarily startled, then went over to Freddie, shook his hand, and welcomed him to the class. She sat him right there in front next to a boy named Rodney. Rodney gave Freddie a high five, and the two of them grinned at each other. Okay, I had to admit, I was jealous. Mrs. Lovelace asked an aide to bring Gloria down front close to the piano. A girl named Elizabeth glanced at Gloria nervously, but she didn't move away when Gloria was wheeled next to her. Elizabeth's best friend is a girl named Jessica. At recess, they sit together near the fence and share granola bars. I've always wondered what they whisper about. I also noticed that everything Elizabeth does, Jessica tries to outdo. Like if Jessica beats her running to the fence, Jessica insists they run again so she can win too. Or if Elizabeth gets a new book bag, Jessica will have a new one the next day. So when Elizabeth started talking to Gloria, who looked terrified, by the way, Jessica raised her hand and asked if one of the age 5 kids could sit next to her. Maria might have trouble figuring out some stuff, but she's a real friendly person. I want to sit by the blue shirt girl. I want to sit by the blue shirt girl, she demanded. She stomped down to Jessica's seat and sat back down next to her. Then she jumped back up and gave Jessica a hug, then gave a hug to the kid sitting closest to Jessica. One kid stiffened up when she touched him, but I was surprised that most of them let her hug them. Molly and Claire, since they were standing, had no choice. Oh, yuck, Claire whispered. Cooties, Molly whispered back. Mrs. Lovelace raised an eyebrow, then cleared her throat. It seems you two like to stand. You'll continue to do so the rest of this week. Aw, man, I heard Claire say. Molly had sense enough to say nothing. Maria didn't notice. She even kissed Claire on the cheek. That was pretty funny. Willie ended up next to a large, friendly boy named Connor. Ashley and Carl were absent that day, so that left me sitting in the back of the classroom by myself. The room got real quiet. I suddenly felt cold, like the air conditioning had been cranked up real high. I got goosebumps all over. The teacher looked around the room, expectation on her face. I guess hoping that somebody would volunteer to take me. At that moment, I would have given anything to be back in our Bluebird room instead of sitting there with 30 kids staring at me. Finally, a girl got up out of her seat and walked over to my chair. She squatted down and looked me directly in the face. Then she smiled. It was the girl with the long hair who had frowned at her friends for laughing. Hi, I'm Rose, she said, her voice soft. I smiled back and I tried really hard not to kick or grunt or make a noise that would scare her away. I held my breath and thought about calm, quiet things like ocean waves. It worked. I inhaled deeply and slowly, then pointed on my board to "Thank you." Rose seemed to understand. I showed her I could power my own chair, and I rolled to where she'd been sitting. We sat together for the rest of the class, and I didn't do a single embarrassing thing. It ended way too soon. But ever since, every Wednesday, our little class of outcasts get to join Mrs. Lovelace's music class. It's awesome. Jill, Ashley, and Carl eventually became a part of the group. Each one of us has been assigned a buddy to sit next to and interact with. Once they met her, all the girls rushed to be Ashley's buddy. I think it's like playing with a pretty little doll for them, but Ashley seems to like the attention. Claire and Molly eventually got their chairs returned, but they haven't chosen to be buddies for anyone yet. That's fine with me. Elizabeth and Jessica have stuck with Gloria and Maria. Jill sits contentedly next to a girl named Aster Chang. Rodney actually comes over at recess and talks to Freddie. Sometimes he pushes Freddie really fast in his chair, and Freddie really loves that. And I get to sit with Rose every single Wednesday. On Tuesday, I can hardly sleep because I'm so excited. I make my mother pick out my nicest clothes on Wednesday morning, cool outfits like the other kids wear. I screech at her until she gets just the right combination. I make sure she brushes my teeth so my breath won't stink.